Every man in that bar had been there before him. Not in the same chair, not with the same woman, but with the same look. The look of a man who stopped listening to the people who loved him most, because the woman sitting across from him felt more important than anyone's warning. Gary Millward was 67 years old, retired engineer, Angeles City, Philippines. His friends told him, his son told him, his ex-wife told him from 3 time zones away. Every single person in his life looked him in the eye and said, "Something is wrong." And he lost $485,000 finding out they were right. The night I put my head in my hands at that bar, Phil put his arm around my shoulder and didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His silence said everything his mouth had already said 6 months earlier, when I still had a chance to listen. Ray was sitting across from me with his arms folded, shaking his head in the slow, disappointed way of a man who is too tired to say "I told you so" out loud and knows he doesn't need to. I had a half-empty San Miguel in front of me, 4 empties already pushed to the edge of the table. My wedding ring was in my pocket, not because I was married anymore. I hadn't been for 9 years, but because I'd been wearing it in the Philippines out of some idea that it made me look less like a target. That idea had not worked. I sat in that bar and I tried to remember when exactly I had stopped being the kind of man who listened to his friends. When I had decided that my own need, my own hunger for something I couldn't name precisely, was more reliable than 40 years of friendship between men who had seen me at my best and my worst and still showed up. I couldn't find the moment. That's the honest answer. There wasn't one moment. There was a long, slow drift away from every voice that was trying to keep me safe, toward the voice of a woman named Soledad Reyes, who was 41 years old and worked as a property agent in Angeles City, and who had, from the very first week, understood something about me that I had not yet understood about myself. She understood that I was available, not in the romantic sense, not initially. Available in the deeper sense, the sense of a man whose defenses have been worn down not by any single event, but by years of accumulated smallness. Years of retirement that didn't feel like freedom. Years of an empty house in Portland, Oregon, that I had bought to grow old in with someone and was now growing old in alone. Years of phone calls with my son Kevin that were shorter than I wanted them to be, and further apart than felt right. Calls that ended with both of us promising to talk more and neither of us quite managing it. Years of being fine in a way that meant I had stopped expecting anything more. I had come to Angeles City for the second time when I met Soledad. The first trip had been 8 months before that, a month-long visit with Phil, who had retired there 3 years earlier and who had built a life among the expat community that centered around a small bar he co-owned on Fields Avenue. Phil was American like me, ex-Air Force, had met his Filipino wife Rowena. Not the one on the list, his Rowena, a different woman entirely, in the late 90s when he was stationed nearby and had never really left the orbit of the place. He was my oldest friend, going back to college in Oregon, and he had told me for years that I should come out and see what life felt like when it wasn't organized around obligation. My first trip had been good, genuinely good. I liked the warmth, not just the climate, but the warmth of daily life. The way people in Angeles City talked to strangers, the food that was simple and extraordinary, the general sense of a city that was operating at a human pace rather than the automated pace I associated with Portland. I liked Phil's bar, the expat community that gathered there, the complicated mix of people who had come from all over the Western world and found in this particular corner of the Philippines some version of what they needed. Some of them were running from something. Some of them were running toward something. Most of them were doing both, and nobody judged anybody else for it, which was its own kind of relief. I went home after that first month and spent 4 months in Portland thinking about going back, thinking about what it would mean to spend more time there, or to base myself there for a portion of each year. I had the financial means. I had retired at 63 after 31 years as a structural engineer with a firm in Portland, sold the business interest I'd accumulated over those years, and had a retirement position that was comfortable without being extravagant. My ex-wife Donna had her portion from the divorce settlement, and we were on reasonable terms, the reasonable terms of 2 people who had been honest enough with each other to admit the marriage had become a habit rather than a choice. Kevin was in Denver, doing well in his own life, not needing anything from me materially. The house in Portland was paid for, the numbers worked. I went back to Angeles City in the October of the following year. This time I rented an apartment rather than staying in a hotel, because I wanted to see what the city felt like from the inside rather than the outside. I had told Phil I was coming, and he had, with the particular caution of a man who has watched this pattern play out many times in his expat community, said, "Gary, come. But come with your eyes open." I had told him my eyes were always open. He had said, "That's what they all say." I met Soledad at a property viewing. She was the agent showing a condominium unit in a development near the Clark Freeport zone that Phil had suggested might be worth looking at as an investment property. A small unit that could be rented to other expats if I decided to formalize my time in the Philippines. She showed me through the unit with a professional ease, answered my questions about rental yields and development management, and when we got to the end of the viewing and I asked where the nearest good coffee was, she pointed to a place 2 streets away and said she was heading there herself if I wanted to walk. That was how it started, walking to a coffee shop. Nothing that required any decision, any deliberation, any weighing of options. Just a property viewing that ended with coffee, and coffee that went on for an hour and a half longer than coffee needs to go on if it's actually about coffee. Soledad was good at conversation in a way that I noticed and should have examined more carefully than I did. She asked questions that were specific rather than generic. Not where are you from and what do you do, but what made me choose structural engineering over architecture when the two are so closely related, and whether retirement had felt like freedom or like falling off a cliff. I answered the second question honestly, more honestly than I had answered it to anyone in Portland, including Phil when he asked by phone. I said it had felt like both in alternating doses, and that the falling feeling had not entirely gone away in 4 years of retirement. She said she understood that she had watched her father retire from the provincial government in Pampanga and spend 6 months unable to find his footing, and that it had frightened her because he was such a capable man, and she had never seen him uncertain before. That specificity, the father, the provincial government, the visible uncertainty of a capable man, made the answer feel real rather than sympathetic. I believed her. The believing happened fast and should have happened slower. We had coffee twice more that week. On the third coffee she mentioned, without apparent agenda, that she sometimes helped foreign clients not just with property purchases, but with broader investment planning, connecting them with developers and land opportunities that weren't listed on the standard market, but that she had access to through her professional network. She said it carefully, in the way of someone who is not pushing something but making sure an available door is visible. I said that was interesting. She said she could share some details if I wanted. I said sure. I want to be precise about what happened over the following 3 months, because precision is the thing I owe to Phil and to Ray and to Kevin, all of whom asked precise questions that I answered imprecisely, because precision would have required me to look at things I had chosen not to look at. The first investment opportunity Soledad brought me was a land parcel in a development corridor outside Clark that she said was being acquired in advance of a major infrastructure project. She had documentation, land title copies, a project overview from a developer she said was registered and legitimate projected appreciation figures based on comparable corridor developments in Metro Manila. The amount she said was needed to secure the parcel was $42,000. She didn't pressure me. She showed me the materials, explained the opportunity in clear terms, and said the decision was entirely mine and that she had other clients interested if I wasn't. I sat with it for a week, asked her several follow-up questions, and then transferred $42,000 to the account she provided. Phil found out about it the following week. Not because I told him. I hadn't told him, which was the first real symptom of the thing that was happening, but because Angeles City is a small expat world, and small expat worlds have their own information circulation. He came to my apartment on a Tuesday afternoon and he said, "Gary, I heard you bought some land with Soledad Reyes." His voice was neutral, but his eyes were not neutral. I said I had made an investment, yes. He said, "How much?" I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How well do you know her?" I said I knew her well enough to be comfortable with the decision. He said, "That's not the same as well enough." I told him I appreciated his concern and that I had done my due diligence. He said, "What due diligence?" I said I had reviewed the documentation. He said, "Gary, documentation in this market can be fabricated for about $200. Did you have a lawyer review the title?" I said I had not. He said, "Did you check the developer's SEC registration?" I said I had not. He looked at me for a long time and then he said, "I'm going to ask you something and I need you to be honest. Is this just about the investment?" I said of course it was just about the investment. He said, "Good, because if it's not, You need to slow down about 3 speeds. I told him the investment was the investment, and the relationship was the relationship, and they were separate. That sentence was not entirely false and not entirely true, and I knew it when I said it, which means I was already at the $42,000 mark in the territory of choosing what I wanted to be true over what I knew to be true. Ray came around the same time Phil did, though I think separately and not in coordination. Ray was Australian, had been in Angeles City for 8 years, ran a small construction consulting operation, and had the particular steadiness of a man who had learned his lessons about this place the hard way in his first 2 years, and was now 8 years in, someone other newcomers listened to. He and Phil were close, and he and I had become friends during my first visit. He sat down across from me and said without preamble, "Tell me about Soledad." I told him what I'd told Phil. He listened without interruption and then said, "Has she talked to you about other investments yet?" I said she had mentioned some possibilities. He said, "How many properties has she actually sold? I mean to verified buyers, completed sales, documented." I said I didn't know specifically. He said, "Gary, I've been here 8 years. I've seen a lot of property agents. The good ones have a trail, names you can call, completed transactions you can check. Have you called anyone who bought from her?" I said no. He said, "That's the first thing you do before the second one." I did not do the first thing before the second one. The second investment came 6 weeks after the first. Another land parcel, this time inside the Clark-Freeport zone boundary, which Soledad said was even more strategically valuable because of the zone's special economic status. The documentation was more elaborate, more pages, more official-looking seals, a more detailed projected return schedule. The amount was $78,000. By this point, Soledad and I had been having dinner together twice a week, and the coffee meetings and the dinners had settled into something that had the rhythm and the texture of a relationship without either of us having used that word. She was warm and engaged and consistently interesting, and the parts of me that had been running on low for 4 years of retirement were receiving something they needed, and that need was making my judgment perform below its actual capacity. I did not tell Phil about the second investment until after I had made it. When I told him, he sat in silence for longer than Phil usually sits in silence, which is not very long. Then he said, "Gary, how much is she getting from you in total?" I said it wasn't like that, that these were legitimate investment decisions. He said, "How much total?" I told him. He said, "And you've verified the first parcel is actually in your name and legally registered." I said I had the documentation. He said, "That's not what I asked. I had not verified the first parcel. I had the documentation, and I had not verified the documentation. These are the same kind of not the same thing that I kept constructing during this period, and that I am no longer interested in constructing in hindsight." Kevin called from Denver around this time. His mother Donna had mentioned to him that she had heard I was spending a lot of time in the Philippines, and that she was a little concerned. Kevin was careful on the phone. Careful in the way of a son who has learned that being too direct with his father produces defensive distance, and that careful questions reach places direct challenges don't. He asked how the trip was going. I said, well. He asked what I'd been up to. I said exploring the area, looking at some investment opportunities. He asked what kind of investments. I described them in general terms. He was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Dad, are you doing this with someone you're seeing?" I said I was doing it with a property agent who was professional and well-connected. He said, "Are you also seeing her?" I said it was complicated. He said, "Dad, just my name." Just that. And in the way he said it, I heard everything he had decided not to say, and I understood it, and I went on doing what I was doing. The third investment came at the 8-month mark. A residential development project, not a land parcel this time, but an actual construction project outside the Clark zone. A boutique development of 8 units that Soledad said a developer she worked with regularly was financing in phases, and that needed equity from limited partners at this stage. She said the returns at completion were projected at 40% above cost. She said she personally had a small position in the project. The amount to secure my limited partner interest was $145,000. This was the largest single amount by a significant margin, and it was, I recognized at some level, a test. Not of her character, but of mine, of how far the drift had gone. I agreed to it in 3 days. 3 days is the shortest deliberation window of any of the investments, and it was the largest one. Phil and I had a significant argument about it. The word argument is accurate. We raised our voices, which is something we had not done with each other in 40 years of friendship. He said the amount was reckless. I said I had reviewed the documentation and was comfortable with the risk. He said, "Gary, you're not reviewing documents. You're rationalizing decisions you've already made because you're emotionally invested in the person presenting them." I said he was projecting. He said, "I've watched 20 men do this in 8 years. It doesn't end the way you think it ends." I told him I was capable of managing my own affairs. He said, "I know you are, but right now you're not." That was the conversation where I walked out. I left Phil's bar in the middle of the afternoon on a Wednesday, and I walked back to my apartment, and I sat on the balcony looking at the street below, and I thought, with the specific clarity of a man who can see exactly what he's doing and has decided to do it anyway, that Phil was probably right about some of it, and that I was going to proceed regardless. Because the thing I had found in Soledad's company, the specific quality of being seen and engaged and present that I had been missing for years, was worth more to me at that moment than the voice of my oldest friend. That is the decision I am most ashamed of. Not the money, or not only the money, the decision to choose a feeling over a friendship. To treat Phil's 38 years of knowing me as less reliable than 8 months of evenings with a woman I barely understood. The fourth investment came 4 months after the third. By this point, I had spent nearly a year in the Philippines with periodic returns to Portland that were growing shorter. The Portland house felt increasingly foreign to me. The life there had a quality of obsolescence, of a version of myself that I had outgrown without quite knowing it. The Philippines felt alive in the way the Portland life did not, and I knew, even then, that a significant portion of that aliveness was Soledad, which meant that what I was building was not a new life but a dependency on one person's warmth, and that the two things were not the same, and that confusing them was the error at the center of everything. The fourth investment was $95,000, an agricultural land opportunity in Nueva Ecija that Soledad said was being consolidated for a commercial greenhouse operation. She said the provincial governor's office had endorsed the project. She showed me a letter. The letter looked official. By this point, Phil and I were speaking, but not comfortably. The argument we'd had not fully resolved. Ray had taken the approach of quiet availability. Present when I wanted to talk, not pressing when I didn't. Waiting with the patience of a man who has seen this movie before and knows you can't stop it by running into the screen. He told me once, simply and without drama, "Gary, I like you and I'm going to be here when this is done." I had asked what he meant by "when this is done." He had said, "When you need to understand what happened." Soledad during this period was consistent in a way I have thought about many times since. She did not become more demanding as the investments grew. She did not push. She maintained the same quality of attention, the same warmth, the same intelligent engagement with whatever I wanted to talk about, as she had from the first coffee in October of the year before. That consistency was either character or professionalism, and I have not been able to decide with certainty which it was, and I have learned to accept that I may never be able to decide. The fifth investment was when things began to visibly change. She came to me in the third month after the Nueva Ecija commitment with an opportunity she described as time-sensitive. A resort development on the Bataan coast, 6 units, a foreign developer she said she had worked with 3 times before, a closing window of 30 days. The amount was $125. She said the developer was moving quickly because a Korean hospitality group had expressed acquisition interest in the completed project, and the developer needed to close the equity round before the acquisition discussion made the land price move. She said she could vouch for the developer personally. She said she had people I could call. Something in me noticed the difference in this conversation. Not alarm. I don't want to overstate my perceptiveness at this point, because I was not performing well as a perceptive person, but a quality of change tempo, the 30-day window, the acquisition story that added urgency, the offer to provide references that felt like an answer to a question I hadn't asked. I sat with it for 2 weeks, and during those 2 weeks, I did something I had not done properly for any of the previous investments. I tried to verify things. I went to the Bureau of Internal Revenue office, where a property deal of this scale should have left a documentary trail. I asked about the developer's name. The person I spoke to was unable to find a registration consistent with the name Soledad had given me. I went to the Securities and Exchange Commission satellite office and asked about the developer's corporate registration. Nothing clear. I asked a Filipino accountant I had been introduced to through the expat community to make inquiries through his professional network. He came back to me 3 days later and said he had not been able to independently verify the developer's existence as described. I brought this to Soledad. I sat across from her in the apartment she shared with a colleague in Dow, and I told her what I had found, or rather what I had not found. I was calm about it. I was not accusatory. I said I had been trying to verify the developer and was running into dead ends and wanted to understand why. She had an answer. She said the developer operated through a holding company, and that the operating entity name I'd been given was a subsidiary that wouldn't show up under a direct search. She said she would provide the holding company name and registration. She said the BR and SEC trail would be cleaner once I knew the right entity to search for. She sent me a document 2 days later with a holding company name and a registration number. I asked the accountant to check that too. He came back and said the holding company appeared to be registered, but had no significant transaction history consistent with the kind of development activity she was describing. I did not make the fifth investment. This was the right decision, and it was approximately 10 months and $360,000 late. The reason I didn't make it was not entirely about the verification failure. Part of it was Phil. Phil, with whom I had been in an uncomfortable half-restored friendship since the argument, had said something to me about 3 weeks before the fifth investment conversation that I had filed away, and that surfaced during the 2 weeks I was trying to verify things. He had said, "Gary, the worst moment in this kind of situation isn't when you find out something is wrong. It's the moment before, when you have enough information to know something is wrong, but you're still hoping you're misreading it." I had said I appreciated the wisdom. He had said, "I'm not offering wisdom. I'm telling you what you look like right now." When I told Soledad I wasn't proceeding with the fifth investment, she was composed. Not cold, not hurt, composed. She said she understood, that the timing wasn't right for everyone, that there would be other opportunities. Her composure in that moment produced in me a feeling that was not relief, but something closer to grief, because I understood that what I had decided was not just about the fifth investment. I understood it had implications for the whole arrangement, for what Soledad and I were to each other, which was inseparable from what I had given her to build over the previous 10 months. I went to Phil's bar that evening. Phil was behind the counter doing what co-owners of small bars do in the early evening, which is inventory and light conversation with the first arrivals. I sat at the bar and I told him I hadn't made the fifth investment. He looked at me steadily for a moment and then said, "Good." I said, "I need to understand the first 4. He said, "I know." He poured 2 drinks and came out from behind the bar and sat down next to me, and we began the conversation that I had been avoiding for 10 months. Ray arrived an hour later, which may have been coincidence and may not have been. I still don't know whether Phil called him. He sat across from us and he listened to the part he hadn't heard, and then he said, without drama, "How much in total, Gary?" I told him the total. $360,000 committed across 4 investments, none of which I had been able to fully verify as represented. He absorbed that number the way men absorb large numbers that confirm what they already suspected, with a stillness that is the absence of the surprise they don't feel. The 3 of us spent that evening, and a significant part of the following 2 weeks, trying to understand the actual status of the 4 investments. Phil connected me with a Filipino lawyer he trusted, a woman named Addie Santos, who had handled several expat property matters in the Clark area, and who was known in the community for her directness. Addie Santos reviewed the documentation I had for all 4 investments. She was methodical and clear, and at the end of her review she said, "Mr. Millward, I want to be careful about what I tell you because I have not independently verified all of these. But my assessment is that 2 of these 4 investment documents have significant issues that suggest they may not represent legitimate transactions." I asked which 2. She told me. The first land parcel outside Clark, $42,000, appeared to have a title that was genuine but that was not registered in my name and showed no evidence of a sale transaction. The boutique residential development, $145,000, appeared to reference a developer whose registration had lapsed and whose project permits she could find no evidence of. The other 2, she said, were more ambiguous. Possible legitimate investments with documentation gaps, or possible fraudulent representations with better quality documentation. She said she would need more time to fully assess those. She never fully assessed them, because 2 weeks into her investigation, Soledad became difficult to reach. Messages took longer to get responses. Phone calls went to voicemail and were returned hours later. The meetings I proposed were postponed once, then twice, then not rescheduled. It was not a sudden disappearance, nothing so dramatic or obvious. It was a slow withdrawal, calibrated to produce maximum ambiguity, maximum room for me to tell myself that she was busy, that her schedule was full, that this was a temporary gap and not the ending I was beginning to understand it was. The last time I spoke to Soledad directly was by phone on a Thursday morning. I had been trying to reach her for 5 days. She answered on the third attempt, sounding normal, sounding like herself in every register I had learned to recognize over 10 months. She said she had been managing a difficult family situation in Pampanga. She said she was sorry for the delays and that she would call me back that weekend to reschedule. She sounded completely like a person who intended to call back that weekend. She did not call back that weekend. The following week, her number went to a recorded message that said the number was not available. The property agency phone number, the one on her original business card, rang without answer for 3 consecutive days and then went silent. Phil and Ray were with me when I understood it was done. Not in a dramatic moment, there was no single moment of revelation. It was just the morning when I sat with the documentation from Addie, Santos, and the unreturned calls and the disconnected number, and accepted the picture they made together. I called Phil and asked if he and Ray could come by. They both came within the hour. Phil made coffee, and Ray sat with the documentation, and neither of them said the thing they had a right to say. Phil said, eventually, "What do you need right now?" I said I needed to understand what I could still recover and what I couldn't. Ray said Addie Santos is the person for the first question. For the second question, you already know the answer. I said I knew. He said, then we deal with what's recoverable. The subsequent assessment took several months. Addie Santos filed complaints with the appropriate authorities. An NBI investigation was initiated. The 4 investments were examined individually and in combination. The conclusions were difficult and not surprising. Of the $360,000 I had committed, approximately $85,000 could be considered potentially recoverable through the civil process, though recovery timelines were uncertain. The remaining $275,000 was assessed as effectively lost, either directed into non-existent investments, diverted from legitimate investment accounts before transfer, or structured in ways that made tracing through Philippine financial mechanisms extremely difficult. The additional $125,000 in the title figure represents the costs I incurred during the investigation, legal fees, and 2 transactions from earlier in my time in the Philippines. Smaller amounts I had spent on introductory activities that formed part of the broader pattern Addie Santos identified. The full $485,000 is the number that the title gives, and the number I have accepted as the accurate accounting of what this cost me. I called Kevin in Denver the night after Addie Santos gave me the full preliminary assessment. It was late in Denver. I had calculated the time difference and then called anyway because I needed to hear his voice and because the alternative was sitting alone in the apartment with the number. He answered, recognized something in how I said his name, and said, "Tell me," I told him. The full version from the first coffee to the disconnected phone number. He listened without interrupting for a long time. When I finished, he said, "Dad, are you okay?" I said I was not immediately okay, but that I would be. He said, "What do you need?" I said right now I needed him to know and not to say anything that would require me to respond in a complicated way. So he said, "Okay, I'm not saying anything complicated. I'm just here." We stayed on the phone for another 20 minutes without talking much. That was worth something. That was worth a significant something. Donna called the following week. Kevin had told her, which I had expected and did not resent. She said she was sorry. She said it in the tone of a woman who has known someone for decades and understands the specific ways they are vulnerable and is sorry that this vulnerability was found. Not sorry in a pitying way, in an honest way. She said, "Gary, you were always someone who needed to be needed. That's not a flaw. It just makes you findable by people who are looking for that." I said I knew. She said, "I should have been better at letting you feel needed when we were together." I said that was kind but more complicated than she needed to carry. She said, "I know. I just wanted to say it." We talked for another half hour about things that had nothing to do with any of this, which was its own form of kindness. I have been doing the work of understanding my own part in this for the months since it resolved, and I want to be honest about that work rather than presenting a version that sounds more resolved than it is. The money part I can talk about in a structured way. The legal process is proceeding at the pace legal processes in this context proceed. Addie. Santos remains engaged. There may be partial recovery, probably not full recovery, and my financial position going forward is significantly reduced from what it was. The Portland house is paid for. I have reserves. I am not in a desperate position, and I am aware that not being in a desperate position is itself a form of luck that I didn't earn through any wisdom I displayed during the relevant period. I am 67 years old, and the financial picture going forward requires careful management, but allows for a functional retirement without the margin I had anticipated. I am working on accepting that without resentment, which is going better some days than others. The Soledad part is harder to talk about in a structured way because it resists structure. I do not know, and may never know, the full picture of what Soledad intended from the beginning versus what she found as she went. The investments were fraudulent or largely fraudulent, Addie. Santos's assessment makes that clear. Whether the relationship was a deliberate vehicle for the fraud from the first coffee, or whether it became that over time, or whether she held both things simultaneously in a way that allowed her to feel something genuine while also extracting something financial. I cannot determine that from where I sit. I have considered all three possibilities, and I have learned to hold them as unresolved rather than forcing a conclusion that makes the story cleaner than it actually was. What I can say with confidence is that the need she found in me was real. The loneliness was real. The hunger for engagement and presence, and the specific feeling of being seen by another person after years of being competently invisible to myself. All of that was real, and it was what made the financial judgments I made possible. I was not robbed in spite of my good judgment. I was robbed through my good judgment's temporary suspension, which was made possible by the specific quality of attention Soledad brought to every conversation we had. Real or performed or some mixture of both, it was effective. It found the exact dimension of me that was available to be found. Phil and I repaired the argument. It took a while, and it required me to say things that were not easy to say. Specifically, that I had known he was right and had walked out anyway, and that walking out had been a choice I made consciously, and that the consequences of it were mine to carry. Phil said he knew, and that the walking out had not changed anything about the friendship. He said 40 years is longer than 10 months. I said I knew. He said, that's not a small thing to know. I said I was working on understanding how not small it was. Ray said something to me about 3 months after the investigation concluded that I have thought about regularly since. We were at Phil's bar, a quiet weeknight, just the three of us after the other customers had left. Ray said, Gary, I want to ask you something and I want you to think before you answer. When Phil warned you, when Kevin warned you, when your ex-wife was worried, what was the thing inside you that dismissed all of it? I sat with that for a while. Then I said, I think I believed that what I had found was worth more than what I might lose. And I think I believed that because what I had found felt so specifically like what I had been missing that the idea of letting go of it to be safe felt like too high a price. Ray said, that's the most honest thing I've heard you say about this. I said maybe that was because it was the most honest thought I'd had about it. He said, keep going with that. It'll get you somewhere useful. I am still going with that. It is getting me somewhere that might eventually be useful, though the journey is not fast and does not move in a straight line. I am back in Portland now, at least for this stretch. The apartment in Angeles City I did not renew, a practical decision, but also a decision about not building a life around the geography of a wound. Phil's bar is still there. Phil calls every couple of weeks. Ray sends messages when something in the Philippines news makes him think of the conversation. Kevin came to Portland in December and stayed for 5 days, which was longer than his usual visits, and we talked about more things than we have talked about in years, including some things about what I had been like as a father that were uncomfortable and important, and that I am glad we said. I have not heard from or found Soledad. The NBI has not been able to locate her for the purposes of the investigation, which I am told is not unusual, and which I have accepted as the condition of the landscape I was navigating. Whatever she took, and wherever she went, I am not going to reconstruct myself around the question of where that is. The lesson that people want to take from stories like this is usually some version of, listen to your friends. Don't let your feelings override your judgment. Verify before you invest. All of these are true, and all of them are insufficient, because the kind of situation I was in was not one where the problem was insufficient information. Phil told me, Ray told me, Kevin told me, Donna worried, Addie. Santos existed, and I could have consulted her a year earlier than I did. The information was available. The warnings were there. The real problem was that I had decided, in some quiet part of myself that I had not examined carefully enough, that the need I felt was more authoritative than the people who loved me, that the specific texture of what Soledad's attention gave me was more valuable than 40 years of friendship, and whatever remained of a marriage that had ended honestly, and a relationship with a son I was not seeing enough of. I made that trade. I made it eyes open, at least partially open, over a series of months in which I had repeated opportunities to make a different one. That is the thing I am working on, now, in Portland, in the house that is paid for, and quiet and full of the light of a city I was born near, and that I have never entirely managed to make feel like home. Not managing Soledad's legacy in my financial accounts, though that work is ongoing. Managing the question of what it means to have dismissed the people who cared about me most clearly in favor of a feeling that turned out to be, at least in part, someone else's instrument. I do not have an answer that satisfies me. I have the question, which is where all honest work begins, and I have Phil calling every couple of weeks, and I have Kevin coming to visit longer than usual, and I have the particular quality of a friendship that survived a year of me not listening to it and came out the other side still intact. That is not nothing. That is actually, in the accounting of a 67-year-old man in a paid-for house in Portland, trying to understand what he is worth without the professional identity that organized him for 31 years. Quite a lot. The bar in Angeles City is open tonight. Phil is probably behind the counter. Some other man is probably sitting in a seat I recognize, listening to a woman who has found, with the precision of someone who knows how to look, exactly the thing inside him that is available. I hope someone in that bar is talking to him. I hope he is listening. There is something I want to say about Phil that I haven't said yet, because it belongs in the honest version of this story, and I have been sorting out how to say it without making it sound like a tribute to a friend, rather than an honest accounting of what happened between us. Phil was right about Soledad from early on. Not because he had information I didn't have. He didn't. Not because he was wiser or more perceptive than me in any general sense. We had known each other for 40 years, and I knew where his judgment was better than mine and where it wasn't. He was right because he was standing outside the thing I was standing inside. And outside and inside are different vantage points that produce different conclusions from the same set of facts. When I was inside the thing, inside the warmth of Soledad's attention, inside the feeling of being engaged and present and necessary in a way I hadn't felt in years, the investments looked like investments. They looked like decisions I was making, with my own agency, based on my own assessment of the opportunities she was presenting. From the inside, the pattern of escalating amounts was not a pattern. It was a series of separate decisions, each of which had its own internal logic. Each transfer had a reason. Each reason had documentation. The documentation had answered the questions I had asked of it, and the questions I asked were the questions of a man who wanted the answers to be reassuring. From the outside, Phil could see what I couldn't. He could see the pattern. He could see the escalation. He could see the absence of independent verification. He could see the way my defensiveness when he asked questions was itself a sign that I understood, at some level, that the questions were finding something real. He could see all of this, and he told me about it directly, and I walked out of his bar on a Wednesday afternoon and chose a feeling over 40 years. I have thought a lot about that walking out. It was not impulsive. I want to be clear about that because the impulsive version is easier to understand, and it's not the accurate version. I walked out of Phil's bar knowing I was walking out, knowing why, knowing what I was choosing. I made a deliberate decision that the discomfort of hearing Phil's assessment was less bearable than the discomfort of the doubt that his assessment would create if I stayed and let it land. I left to protect the feeling, not because I was blind to the warning. That deliberateness is the thing I have to carry, not the error of inattention, the error of attention, of seeing the warning clearly and overriding it. I have been in therapy since returning to Portland. Not crisis therapy, just the quiet, regular kind, with a therapist I found through my doctor, a woman in her 50s who has a practice in the Pearl District and who takes the approach of asking good questions and waiting as long as necessary for the honest answers. She asked me early in our sessions what I thought I had been looking for in the Philippines. I said I had been looking for the feeling of being alive in a specific way that Portland had not been providing. She asked what specifically alive meant. I said it meant being engaged with something that required my full attention, that made me feel that the version of me showing up that day was the necessary version, the one with things to offer that would be missed if I weren't there. She said that was a very specific kind of alive. I said I knew. She said, "Where else in your life could that be found?" That question is still open, working on it. Kevin and I have a standing call now, Thursday evenings, which is more than twice what we were doing before any of this. He initiated it, not me, which matters, and which I told him. He said, "Dad, you were isolated for too long. I should have noticed that sooner." I said that wasn't his job. He said, "You're my father. Some of it is my job." We argued about that in the way that fathers and sons argue about the distribution of responsibility, which is to say inconclusively and warmly, and both of us came out of it with something we hadn't had going in. Donna and I have had a series of conversations since all of this happened that are different from the conversations we were having before. Not different in subject. We had covered most subjects in the years of divorce and occasional contact since. Different in register. She said something to me in November that I want to include here because it is the truest thing anyone said to me during this entire period, and it came from the most unexpected direction. She said, "Gary, I think you went to the Philippines because you were lonely in a way that you didn't know how to say to anyone who was close enough to actually help. And I think that loneliness started before the retirement and possibly before the divorce. And I don't know what to do with my part in that, except to say that I see it now, and I'm sorry I didn't see it earlier when it might have made a difference." I sat with that for a long time before I said anything. Then I said it was one of the most generous things she had ever said to me, and that she was more right than I knew how to fully respond to, and that I was going to think about it for a long time. She said, "That's enough. The financial situation, worked out carefully with my accountant in Portland over the past months, looks like this. The $485,000 represents approximately 40% of the liquid retirement capital I had at the point I began this process. What remains, managed carefully, provides a sustainable retirement at a reduced level of comfort. The Portland house, which is paid for, provides stability. Social Security continues. The partial recovery that Addie Santos's process may produce would be a meaningful addition if it arrives, and I am neither counting on it nor writing it off. I am living within what I have and finding, to my moderate surprise, that living within a smaller financial range is less disorienting than I expected. I had more margin than I needed before. I have enough now. Enough is not the same as comfortable margin, but it is genuinely enough, and there is a quality of attention to ordinary things that the reduced margin produces that I have found, in unexpected moments, to be its own form of richness. I want to say something about Angela's city that is not about Soledad, because the city and the woman are two different things, and I am not willing to reduce one to the other. Angela's city is a real place with real people who live real lives that have nothing to do with what happened to me there. Phil built something genuine in that city. Ray built something genuine. The expat community is full of complicated people making complicated decisions, some of which work out and some of which don't, in a country that is not responsible for the decisions any more than Portland is responsible for the decisions people make there. I do not carry resentment for the Philippines. I carry, if I am honest about what I carry, a kind of sorrow for the version of myself who arrived there, looking for something real, and found something that was real in some of its dimensions and not real in others, and who could not, in the moment, tell the difference. That inability is what I am most committed to understanding. Not as self-punishment. I have done enough of that in the months since this ended, and it has not produced anything useful. As honest examination. The inability to tell the difference between real warmth and performed warmth in that specific moment and context was not a random failure of perception. It was produced by something, by years of a specific kind of isolation, by the particular quality of loneliness that accumulates quietly in a paid-for house, in a good city where nothing is wrong and nothing is enough, by the slow reduction of a man who had organized himself around work and competence for 31 years, and then found that without the work, the competence had no stage to stand on. By all of those things meeting, in October in a city I had chosen specifically because it felt alive, a person who had studied what that accumulated hunger looked like and knew exactly how to present herself to it. I am not saying I had no responsibility. I am saying the responsibility sits inside a context, and the context matters for understanding it accurately, and understanding it accurately is the only thing that makes the carrying of it sustainable. Phil's bar is still open. He texted me last week with a photo of the sign, new paint, same name, same spot on Fields Avenue. He said the regulars asked about me. I said to tell them I was doing fine. He said, "Are you?" I said I was getting there, which was more accurate than fine and less dramatic than the full truth. He sent back a thumbs up and then, a minute later, "Come back sometime. Not to find something. Just to visit." I said I'd think about it. He sent, "That's enough. It is enough. Most days right now, enough is what I have and enough is what I'm working with. The people who warned me are still there. That is the thing I did not earn and cannot account for by any fair assessment of what I deserved, and that I wake up grateful for on the days when gratitude is possible, and that I hold quietly on the days when it isn't." 67 years old, Portland, Oregon. Smaller than planned, more honest than before, still here. Still listening, finally listening.